Hi, if you're watching this message right now, it means that you're about to watch between episodes 1 and 23 of my show, Conversations with Atul. Please note that when you'll be watching these first 23 episodes, you will just see a picture of me and a picture of the guest on your screen. That is because the first 23 episodes we never recorded live video. These were audio only episodes meant for Spotify. So what happened was, when I shifted my show to YouTube and started recording video, I felt that my audience should also listen to these first fantastic 23 episodes with some amazing people, great anecdotes, inspiring lives. Like Mukhtar Bhai, who runs a carom club in Thane for the last 35 years. The amazing voiceover artist Nikhil Kapoor, the orchestra man Sudhir Sinha, or the whistler Nagesh Surve. I wanted you to be a part of this experience. One little thing that you will see this message that I've recorded right now before each of the 23 episodes of Conversations with Atul. So, enjoy the conversations and welcome to Conversations with Atul.
Conversations with Atul.
His family includes the 12th President of the United States, folks who made a famous brand of bourbon in Kentucky, and women who excelled in golf at a time when it was frowned upon. However, all that affluence was lost by the time it came to his generation, and life was a lot tougher with food stamps and little money for winter clothes. In a freewheeling conversation about failed violin lessons, a depressed childhood, self-loathing before he came out as gay, his endearing love story, AIDS activism, and a history of student debt in the US, we finally managed to connect the dots on how a man who has majored in psychology and medicine ended up building an enviable career in information technology. Please welcome Global CIO of Cornell University, Dr. Curtis Cole, a man who believes that for a real education, pick the good teachers, irrespective of what they are teaching. Hi, I'm Atul Taishete, and welcome to my podcast, Conversations with Atul. Hello, everybody. So we have a very special guest today. His name is Curtis Cole. He's from the US. And the principal reason why we have him here is because I've had this idea for a different kind of series for a long time. Is that how are we as, who come from different parts of the world, how are we different from each other, or how similar are we? How have we grown up? What is the kind of lives that we have led as children, as grown-ups? How are our values different? These are all these multiple areas that I've always wanted to discover vis-a-vis somebody else and people from different countries. And I think it would be, I always thought it would be fun to have a conversation on issues like this. So today we have, as I said, Mr. Curtis Cole. Hello, Curtis. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's entirely a pleasure. So Curtis, the way I start this podcast is that what we do is that because I believe that primarily all of us are immigrants. We come from various places, and even like though I haven't traveled, but I think my friend who works with you is gone all the way from India and is now working with you in the US. So it's like that. For me too, we have come from somewhere near Goa, and my family is now shifted to. They over the last 5-7 decades they've shifted to Bombay, and so that's how it is. So we'll just go back, and this is somewhere. I think this is the kind of podcast where you can please take your time to to reflect on whatever and give us details on everything. There's no rush, nothing. So can we just go a couple of generations back with your family and where, say, your grandparents come from, what were they doing, and what was the kind of lives they were leading? In which part of the US were they?
I'm probably not the best family historian, so and I've heard different versions of some of these details, but
we know nothing, so
okay.
we are not going to cross-check either. So
on my father's side, there are, his father's family seems to be from New England, and that's the
really?
the Coles. So, and I think there must be some hooks to Maine. And Cold is a pretty common name in the state of Maine, and I think it's a relatively old family by American standards, quite young by Indian standards, but and they are Northern European,
Right.
English, Irish, that kind of background, and then his mother's family was more Southern. And my father's name was Taylor, which was my grandmother's last name. Grand Southern family, the Taylors, which includes many famous branches, one of whom, some of them were involved in the invention of bourbon in Kentucky.
Wow.
Yeah, so, and actually, all the bourbon companies, closed during Prohibition in the 1920s, but some of the brands have been revived, and there are two different Taylor bourbons that are back, that are from that era, one of which we're more closely related to, which is apparently cheaper, nastier bourbon, and then one which is a fancier one, more distant relatives, and that would be the E.H. Taylor, which is one of the finest bourbons around. And
So that is your family which was involved in discovering or making bourbon.
I think so. That's what I've been told. Yeah, yeah. And actually,
No,
President.
I mean, you've been told, so it
Yeah.
obviously must be true.
Well, I don't know. Family myths are pretty common. And then apparently Zachary Taylor, who is a president, is actually part of that family as well. But again, I don't know the lineage. But at any rate, they were, so that was I wish I knew more about how my grandparents came together, because the, South-North mix is not entirely common. But again, also older Northern European extraction family. And they lived in Philadelphia, which I think is where my father grew up.
Okay.
And my grandmother was an interesting woman. She was kind of a force of nature. Some of my older brothers and sisters knew her very well. I didn't really know her, but she was apparently very strong and independent, and was apparently, for her time, a very famous golfer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and there wasn't a pro circuit in the early part of the 20th century. It was country clubs. But she was part of that circuit. But I don't know that much about her. And then my father's father was a colonel, and I believe he actually served under MacArthur.
He was in the army.
He was in the army. He was apparently an unpleasant person. So, on my mother's side.
Let's get back to your grandmother, who was a golfer. Wasn't it very difficult during those times for women to be in sports? And this must be at least in the 20s and 30s, right?
Right, yeah. Well, and I think, she must have been, she was an old family, and they must have had means if they were members of country clubs and stuff. And I think, what was difficult for women generally was not necessarily difficult of women of a certain class. So,
Right.
So I think I imagine that was why she was able to do it. But nonetheless, it was stated that it was an accomplishment, and it was always said that she was very forward and progressive in that regard.
Well, that is true, I think, even in India, what was available to a certain class of women was not really available, for class of men also, not available say you go lower down with lesser resources, and that was not really available. To reach that class, it would take you like 4 generations, and that is what has happened in this country. So say a certain kind of family which was affluent and had the means, in 1920s, I think the people who were probably cleaning their latrines at that point in time, their children are better off today, after almost 80, 90, 100 years. So it's fantastic to note that it's the same as somewhere else. Yeah, and you're saying something about your fathers, I think.
No, I was talking about my mother's family.
Right.
So my mother's family is not as old in terms of their American lineage. They were of German extraction, so they came over closer to the last century, around I would guess around the 1900s. I imagine. I don't actually know that for sure. And the story goes that my great grandfather was a farmer, but a very industrious and smart one. And he ended up buying a lot of land in Philadelphia, and he ended up becoming a real estate developer. And again, I don't know if this is mythology, but I was told that by the time of his death, he had built 1/3 of the housing in the city of Philadelphia.
Really?
And if you go to Philadelphia, you can see there's rows and rows of low-income row houses and stuff. Apparently that was his. His name was Simon, and he became a very, very rich man. He was not educated, and became politically important. And again, I don't know whether this is true, but I love the sentence so much that I love telling this story, because he has, I think, one of the best resume entries I've ever heard, which is, I'm told he was the senior economic advisor to President Herbert Hoover, who, of course, oversaw the creation of the Depression. So,
oh my God.
And apparently, just desserts, he did lose most of his money in the Depression.
In the Depression. That's in the 1930s, right?
Yes, yeah.
Oh my God.
So, and I don't know when he died or where, but he left his money to his wife, who is this uneducated farm woman, and then his daughters, and that would be my grandmother, and my grandmother was a flapper.
What does that mean?
So in the 1920s, the young women who were wealthy and part of society were known for their parties and socialites, yeah. F. Scott Fitzgerald, that world.
Okay.
Yeah. So she was in that fast set, and she lived a high life, and to the end of her life, she was something else. She and my mother hated each other. And I'm told that my grandmother lived off of a trust that was created by, her father, I guess. But she burned through that. And then he had created trusts for the next generation, which would have been my mother's generation. Oh. And she spent
most of it.
A lot of the money. She broke into her children's trust. And in fact, that I know to be true because that I heard from her. Because I visited her towards the end of her life in a nursing home. And I was there with my husband, who is Jewish. And in a completely shameless way, she told this story. And she talked about how I hired myself a Jew lawyer to break into those trusts. She was quite the bigot.
So there was zero regret from her end. She didn't regret it at all.
No, not at all. Not the least.
Rather, it was a story to tell others.
Yeah, it was a story to tell. And so she lived this high life. She lived in this beautiful nursing home at the end of her life.
Which was also funded by your mother's money, of course.
And I remember at one point, the food there was famously very good. And I remember visiting her once, and she said, if I can't eat oysters, I don't want to live. And sure enough, at the end of her life, she wasn't able to eat, and about 3 days later, she died. Right. So,
she had a great life.
Yeah,
anyway.
She had a great life. Yeah.
Maybe your mother suffered, but she had a great life anyway.
Yeah. So that's what I know about that generation.
Oh God. And then, a lot of that money was burnt, and so it was burnt through. So there was not much left for your mother. Not much left for your father either, I guess.
Right, yeah. So they were, what we would refer to as déclassés. So they came from families.
Déclassés?
Yeah.
What would be the spelling?
I guess it means of the classes. I guess it would be French.
Okay.
Yeah. And I believe, so they came from, families that had money, and then they themselves did not have money.
Okay.
But my father came from actually, a real society family, not as wealthy as my mother's family, but an actual old established family. And whereas my mother's family
The
was
bourbon family.
Yeah, right. But whereas my mother's family was nouveau riche.
Right.
So they were looked down on because they were the new immigrants of
You
the
don't
time.
know anything about culture.
Yeah, right.
That's how but that's how it is. I think even in India, I mean, like, I think there is a certain. I mean, India, it's also far more complicated in terms of caste, and because the caste and the class are also mixed up.
Yeah.
But because if you have had privileges for centuries, obviously you belong to a certain class. Most of those people will belong to a certain class, and then there would be a certain looking down upon people who are nouveau riche, new money, and maybe not the kind of education that somebody else has. So I guess it's somewhere pretty similar. So, and then what happened with your parents? How was life with them?
So
Where did they meet, and how were they? Any idea?
I don't actually know how they met. I don't know that much about my own family history, and I've heard various stories from my older brothers and sisters, and they are all absolutely certain that they know the family history. And I know from talking to them that they tell different stories. So I sort of, kind of goes in one ear and out the other. But, my father, so they were both in Philadelphia families. So I guess they met in Philadelphia. I think they got married right after World War II.
Okay.
My father's education was interrupted by the war. He went to Bowdoin College, which is where I went to college, actually, and that's a college in Maine. And his father had gone there, and his father's father had gone there.
Oh my
very
God.
old tradition in the family to go to Bowdoin. And and my mother went to Wellesley, which is a very storied women's college, actually a very good women's college. We like to joke that she probably had to buy her way in, but
She had to buy her way in.
yeah. Well, I know one of the reasons that we say that is because my husband's mother also went to Wellesley at the same time.
Okay.
And she was Jewish. So if you were Jewish in that period, you really had to be very good to get into these waspy society colleges. You had to be very smart. And Lad's mother was brilliant. She was very, very smart. And they did not travel in the same circles, let's just say. So I don't really know how they met. I think clearly my mother thought she was marrying a society.
She's marrying into society.
Society, yeah. And I don't know what my father saw in my mother. My mother, she was very pretty at the time. Who knows? But he... when he got back from the war, I guess he finished I think he may have finished college via correspondence while he was still in England. There was a way for soldiers to continue some education. In fact, one of my sisters found some letter between him and the dean of Bowdoin about how to finish his school. So that must have been a very interesting period. And then I guess on the GI Bill, I'm not sure, but he went to Columbia Teacher College.
Okay.
So after they got married, they moved to Manhattan, and my father...
I'll just interrupt you, but I'm saying that, do you have, has he ever narrated stories of the war to you? I mean, like...
A little
when
bit.
He was...
Yeah, he did that more with my older brothers and sisters. I'm 8th of 9 children.
Okay.
So my parents were kind of worn out by the time I was around. And I actually... my parents were like grandparents to me. I was really raised by my oldest sister. Okay. And all of my emotional identification that you would normally have as a mother, I have with her. Even to the point that when I was a teenager, I had a teenage rebellion against her. Rebellion. But ever since I was a baby, I was her kid. Because my mother got very sick after I was born. And so she was in high school, and she took care of me, from the minute I was born. She's the one who I'm really very attached to and have all those feelings. It's, my parents...
She was like 15 years elder to you.
She would have been, 15 or 16, something
16
like that.
years elder to you. What's her name?
Carolyn.
Carolyn Cole.
Yeah. We're all C's, all 9 of us. Our first name begins with C.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Right.
So that's what? That's a superstition or that's a family tradition or no idea?
No idea. I've heard various stories, but I don't believe any of them. So I think it was just a quirk my parents had. So my father then became a teacher, and my father was always very, very committed to teaching. He felt very passionately about it. I think he was a very good teacher, actually. He wouldn't do well in the modern school system. He yelled too much, but he was a math teacher. He taught math and computer science. I actually had him as a teacher.
You had him as a teacher?
Because he was the only computer science teacher. So, he taught in private schools. I guess after he finished Columbia, I don't know if it was his first job, but he ended up moving to Los Angeles, and he worked at a famous private school there, which was then called the Harvard School. It's merged with something else, has a different name now. But and so that was a fancy school with Hollywood and
children of Hollywood
celebrities and stuff like that. So we were all born in Los Angeles. 8 of 9 of us were born in LA. And then when I was 3 years old, and my mother was pregnant with my younger sister, we moved back east to Philadelphia. And again, I'm not quite sure exactly why, but I assume it was just a little too much to handle alone, and my father really he wanted us to know the grandparents, particularly his mother. So we moved back to Philadelphia. My father got a job working at the Episcopal Academy, which is a fancy private school just outside of Philadelphia, founded by Benjamin Franklin. When he founded the University of Pennsylvania, he founded the prep school Episcopal Academy. And it was an all-boys school at that point. And all 5 boys went there. And then at some point it became co-ed, and so my youngest sister went there as well. I think I'm the only one who went all the way through. I went from nursery school all the way through 12th grade at Episcopal.
At this school?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was, interesting to, going back to the class, of course, I was, surrounded by rich kids, and we were not rich because we lived on my father was a private school teacher, had a very modest salary, and there were so many kids. So that was odd. And we didn't, we were never, we were certainly not poor. But relative to where we lived, we were always out of sync. We had the wrong clothes, didn't have enough food, stuff like that. I mean, when we first got there, again, I'm told, I was too young to remember this, none of the kids had winter clothes.
Wow.
They all had to, my older sisters, had to learn how to make clothes in a hurry. Because they were not prepared for winter. Because there
was lack of money? Or
yeah. I mean, and I think my parents were just kind of clueless about a lot of things. My brothers and sisters were, I think we were supportive of each other. We certainly fought like siblings fight, but I think we kind of took care of each other. My older brothers and sisters worked, and they kind of added a certain amount of parental stability. My mother was, at home. She's not mentally well. She's kind of nutty. She at some point became extremely religious, sort of evangelical religious. She was always...
You're Jewish, right? I mean,
No.
Okay.
No. I believe my father was brought up a Presbyterian and my mother was brought up a Lutheran. And
Okay.
somehow they compromised on Anglican. So I was raised as an Anglican, Episcopal Academy.
Okay.
Episcopal and Anglican are synonymous.
No, it made no sense to me, honestly, because I don't know the difference.
Oh, okay. Well, Anglican Church is, when Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce and the Pope wouldn't let him,
Okay.
he took England out of the Catholic Church
Catholic
and
Church.
created the Anglican Church.
Anglican Church.
So it's the closest that you can get to Catholicism as a Protestant. So they have the same rights to a large extent as Catholicism. They don't get quite as heavy into the saints and the little demigods that the Catholics like. But and it's in the United States, it was traditionally sort of the old money WASPs were Anglicans. It's very pro-business.
Yeah, because
pro-forma
obviously the
kind of religion.
clergy and the noblemen and everybody must have shifted along with Henry VIII.
Yeah.
That's what must have happened. So it's old money. Ah, okay.
So, I think many of the founding fathers were either Anglicans or Congregationalists. And there's a bunch of those old waspy religions. But it's kind of interesting because it is, Anglicans are traditionally pretty, liberal's the wrong word because, certainly in the 70s, it was one of the more progressive mainline religions.
Okay.
And actually, when I was growing up, my father was very conservative politically. He grew up in a very politically conservative home, and he subscribed to pretty right-wing stuff. Like he was in this study section run by this guy, Colonel Stephen Uzel, who was a nut job. And wanted to go back to the gold standard and
Go back to the gold standard.
yeah. I mean, they were sort of there's a thing called the John Birch Society in the United States, which today would be like probably mainstream relative to the Trumpies and the other maggots. But he's but that in that era that was pretty far right. They were kind of the Nixon crowd. They were to the right of Nixon. And
wouldn't that be standard in those times to be more right wing? There would be more right wingers.
well, there were a lot, but my point is that the Anglicans, as a rule,
Were more
were a
liberal.
little bit more socially liberal. So and when I was growing up, they had the blasphemous idea of allowing women to become priests. And that created a rift in the church. And my father was on the conservative side that broke away. And but I grew up, in mainline Anglican thinking, which was pretty progressive for the time.
Right.
They were, it was all about, teaching what Jesus said. And Jesus was pretty progressive, actually, contrary to what the church
Wanted to believe.
want you to believe.
Right.
He had scandalous ideas like being good to poor people. You wouldn't want that.
No, that's
So-
yeah. But that's true. I mean,
So I think I ended up getting a pretty progressive education, despite having grown up in a relatively conservative household. My mother she's still alive. I always have to think about that. But she's way right-wing conservative religion. Well, when I was growing up, what was referred to as a born-again Christian, now you would call just an evangelical. I don't know where she rests politically. It's an interesting question. She used to feel actually very strongly in favor of the separation of church and state.
she used to.
She used to. Yeah, she did actually. And of course now that's evangelicals don't
But
believe
that's
that.
not what is happening in most of the world today. I mean,
Yeah, so I don't actually know where she would fall on that today.
But she was highly religious, right? I mean,
Very, very religious, and she was not very functional as a mother. So all the mothering was done by the other kids. She's a strange woman.
Okay, this move that was made to Philadelphia from LA.
Yeah.
So how did you and your other siblings react to it? Because LA is a very different place, right? And Philadelphia would be a little more conservative, if I understand this right. I mean, or no?
Well, I'm not. I'm not so sure that's true. Remember that California has a very conservative thread to it. Orange County is famously very conservative. Ronald Reagan, grew out of that part of California. There's quite a conservative group in the LA world, so we moved to what's referred to as the main line, which is a sort of upper middle class, green, lush stone house kind of part of suburban Philadelphia. It's called the main line because there's a train. It was one of the first commuter rails in the United States that went, out of a city into the suburbs. And the towns that popped up along it are referred to as the main line. That certainly was a conservative place. But again, conservative and liberal don't mean the same thing today as they did then. So it's kind of hard to know what it means.
But as a child, I mean, because I think even your eldest sibling was how old when you shifted? You were 3, you said, right?
Yeah, she would have been 15, 16, something like that.
That's it.
Yeah, so she went into high school. And I think my oldest brothers and sisters do actually identify as being from LA.
Even now?
Yeah, if you grew up until you were 16 in LA and then you only spent 2 years in Philadelphia, or whatever,
it means nothing.
You probably would tell people you're from LA. I think from the middle on down, they probably identify more as being from Philadelphia. I certainly identify as being more from Philadelphia.
Of course. But what was the kind of reaction within the siblings? Was it all okay?
I don't really know because I was too young. I was too young. I think it was very hard on my oldest brothers and sisters. I think it was a very difficult transition for them. But I don't really know.
Okay. And in school, for example, when you talked about this class difference, because you didn't really have the kind of money that your friends had or the other children in the school had. So how would you define when you say rich and richness within that context? How would you define it? As in terms of what kind of material wealth would define it vis-a-vis you?
Yeah, as a kid, I think the way that you primarily define rich is in a kind of a material way. It's, those kids have the clothes that I want. Those kids have the toys I want. They go on vacation. They're members of a country club. They get to play sports. They get to do all of these things that we didn't do. And I think they had cars, that kind of stuff that would have been my mental framework as a child for understanding wealth. And I didn't actually, I didn't really crave being rich as much as I craved security. I was always aware that things were very stressful around money. And from a very young age, I knew that I did not want to live, I didn't want to live stressed out about money. Yeah. Which the easiest way to do that is to not be poor, but probably the better way to do it is just not get stressed out about money.
Just have money. Yeah. So how would it show along when you are, say, in the same class? Would your friends point it out to you, or would there be subtle nuances?
No, I get made fun of for not having, for my clothes being bad, or and not being able to do things. Like, there were events that I just couldn't be a part of because I couldn't afford to participate.
Do you have friends from this era even today, or?
I have a few people that I'm still in touch with. Yes. I wouldn't, they're not close friends that I call every day, but I do stay in touch with some of those people.
Why I ask you this is because I think some of the closest friendships are made in school and in college. I mean, that's what my view is, because I believe that you can only be friends with people with whom you do a lot of nothing, because that's why I worked in corporate for a long time, and the only 3 years I worked in corporate before I went up to make films. I'm saying that I have only one friend from there. Otherwise, and there used to be a bunch of people around, but you don't really become friends because it's highly competitive, or maybe it's the nature of the business, so it doesn't but with school and college, I have loads of friends from there. So I don't know how, obviously I think it must be the same everywhere. So my question was from that context, as in, whether there were friends that were probably more understood you and your situation better than, and you.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I would say, I would frame it a little differently than what you just said. I think people make friends around shared experience. It's not nothing. Because people get, you become very good friends I'm a doctor. You tend to make good friendships as an intern because you were both under the same horrifying, stressful circumstance. So that's not nothing. What it is an intense shared experience. And I think childhood is an intense shared experience.
No, I mean the same thing, actually. Yeah, you're right.
So I think it's interesting that many of the kids that I still talk to turned out to be gay. And of course, most of us didn't know that when we were in high school. Or we certainly didn't share it with one another. But I think it's interesting that many of us who were friends as when we were young, when we grew up, that was something that we ended up having in common. And that, of course, that's very much an outsider experience.
Absolutely.
From the minute you have any kind of consciousness. So I think that's perhaps true.
So how was otherwise the whole school experience? What happened with you once you were in Philadelphia? I mean, you were 3 years old, and your sister was looking after you. And how was life like as a kid?
Yeah, well, we had a big backyard. I didn't have friends in the neighborhood because all the kids in the neighborhood all went to the local public school, so they were all friends. And because I went to a different school, I wasn't part of that set. And my friends at school, they did a lot of things outside of school. There was at the country club or things like that, and I wasn't part of that either. So I actually spent a fair amount of time alone or with my sisters. I had a really wonderful relationship with my sisters. The one who's 2 older than me, and then my younger sister, and then of course my oldest sister. And whenever I was on vacation from school, I would be with my oldest sister. So, and she, when she graduated from college, she was a journalist, and she was a publisher of small town newspapers. So her first one was in a tiny town in upstate New York. And so we would go to upstate New York, my little sister and me, and spend the summer with her, or Christmas break or something like that. She bought an old house for $5,000, this huge octagon-shaped house. It was a New York State landmark, but had been abandoned for years. And spent years renovating it. So we would go up there and help, rip off wallpaper or paint or plaster. She taught me plumbing, how to use how to connect copper pipes with a blowtorch, electrical work, wiring, plasterboard, all that stuff. She was fearless, and she would just tackle all sorts of stuff like that. And then that was when she was working for a newspaper, and then she moved to suburban Boston, and she owned a newspaper. And then we became, all things working in that paper. So I learned how to take pictures. I learned how to develop film. I was the sports photographer, so I'd go to the kids' games and take pictures of softball games and stuff like that. And then we learned how to do layout. In those days, you'd typeset. I had to learn how to type.
This
She
was
sent me to
blocks,
typing
I
school.
think, right? They used to make it through blocks.
You would this was.
It was block printing, right? I mean, like you made a kind of a block and then no.
You would type into into an early word processor, and it would ultimately create a piece of film. It would,
Right,
and then you would take the film and lay it out using wax on a piece of paper.
And then
And then a photograph was taken of that, and it was burned into an image, which was burned into a plate, which went onto the printing press.
like screen printing, I think it's almost like.
I think it's like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think actually, in many ways, that's where I got more of my interest in computers, was from typesetting equipment.
And how old were you when you were doing all this?
Well, I would visit her when I was very, very young, and I didn't stop working for her until probably I went to college. So it was through all my childhood.
Wow.
So.
So you were somewhere, I guess, a little lonely with with your peers. I mean, there were not really peers.
Yeah, I mean, I had good friends at school, but and then, when in high school, once I had a driver's license, then I was able to participate more. And that, we'd go to people's houses, we'd go to a pizza parlor, we would do stuff, and that I really loved. That was good. But I think when I was younger, I was a little bit more alone. But it wasn't that I was lonely per se, but I mean, because I had my sisters.
The sisters, right?
Who were great. They're lovely people.
So were you like you never felt loneliness? I mean,
I think I did. I don't think I would have identified it as such. I think I was a pretty depressive kid, though.
Okay.
In retrospect, I think I probably was pretty depressed. But as a kid, how do you know? What do you know?
How do you know? And what do you do?
Yeah, and what are you going to do about it? But it wasn't a bleak childhood or anything. We had a lot of exposure to a lot of different things. We would go in summers. We would always spend a week or two in Maine. My father's brother had a house on the water, and we would go there. So I got exposure to that, which was fun. My older brothers and sisters, my parents did stuff with them. They would take them to parks. They would get involved in like Boy Scouts and stuff like that. But they kind of pooped out by the time I was around. So they would sort of go through the motions. My parents were hell-bent on me learning a musical instrument, which I had no interest in whatsoever. And my older sister played the piano, and my brothers were just so mean to her when she practiced that I knew I wasn't going to do that. Somehow, randomly, I said I wanted to play the violin. What a bad idea that was. And so my father dutifully would drive me on Saturdays to the other side of the city to go to these terrible lessons with this earnest musician who smelled terrible. All I remember about my lessons was, in violin, they actually crouch over you to hold your arm and teach the bow. And I just remember, this guy smells terrible. Needless to say, I did not learn the violin.
How were your brothers mean to your sister who was learning the piano? I mean, how?
Because, kids make mistakes, and they would say, oh, that noise is so horrible. They're kids. They're mean, Kids are mean.
Right. So you finished your school here. I mean, you were throughout, and then what happened? I mean,
well, so when I graduated from high school, I went to Bowdoin.
Okay.
Bowdoin was a great experience for me. I really enjoyed it a lot, actually. I mean, there were some periods that were pretty bleak, but for the most part, I had a good set of friends. I came out as gay very early. I knew I was gay when I was in high school. I actually had a boyfriend when I was in high school, but I wasn't. I was still very closeted about it. But then when I was at college, I could actually live a life that I wanted to live, and so I had a great group of gay friends, and we did a lot of stuff. I was politically pretty active. Actually, even when I was in high school, I was like on the debate club and stuff. I really loved politics and argumentation and things like that. So when I was in college, I got very involved in that. And we actually set up the first LGBT political action committee in the state of Maine.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And one of the things about Maine is a very, very small state, population-wise. And so you can do a lot if you're interested, because there's just not a lot of people. And New England has sort of a tradition of participatory democracy more so than much of the rest of the country. So town meeting and things like that. So that was fun. I had great professors, and I worked while I was there. And I had the professor that I worked for was a statistician. And so he had access to the first computers at the college. So I got to learn about the network, and I got to learn about TOPS 10, which was an early operating system, and introduction to programming. It was more statistically oriented programming, but I did, had exposure to that, and he was just a really supportive mentor.
But what were you actually studying there? I mean,
I studied psychology, and that was the main thing that I was really interested in. I started out as a pre-med. I thought I was going to go to medical school, but Bowdoin is a big pre-med school, and I did not like the pre-meds. They were all grinds, and I did very badly in physics, and I knew that was not going to work out for me. So I switched to psychology, which I loved. And while I was there, I was coached a lot by one of my sisters about, pick the good professors. Don't pay so much attention to what they're teaching. Just if you could get into the course from the people who are famously good teachers.
Right.
And so a lot of them were in the history department. So I actually ended up doing a double major in history just because I had accumulated enough credits by picking professors that were
very good.
Very good. So I actually, it's kind of weird. It was I technically was a U.S. history major, but I hardly took any U.S. history. I don't quite know how that happened. I ended up studying 20th century atrocities. So I studied Stalin, Mao, and Hitler. A lot in common between the three of them. And unfortunately, good preparation for today, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So,
that is the template. I mean, right now, I guess that is the template all around the world.
Yep. Unfortunately.
Yeah. So let's get back to this one thing which that when you came out as gay in school, how did you know, what was it, what was different? And because I think the friends around you largely they would be running after girls, right? So this whole concept, particularly in that time also when it must be the 70s, right?
70s, yeah. I mean, I knew I was gay when I was very young.
Okay.
I mean, as soon as I was sort of like aware of anything, I knew that I was different. And I think my sisters knew that I was different too. I don't know that they would have put a name on it, almost certainly not, but they knew that I was quote unquote sensitive. I was very different from my other four brothers. And and they kind of protected me from their bullying. The
sisters protected you from the brothers' bullying.
Yeah. So, for example, actually interesting, funny historical twist. So my older brothers were all part of this Boy Scout troop. So Paoli 1, which I guess was the first Boy Scout troop or something, and it had this very militaristic attitude, and you know, the kids would march, and you know, it was like little fascists, and I wanted no part of it, and I knew that the head of that troop was a creep. As a little proto-gay boy, I picked up that man is trouble. And when I was in college, sure enough, he got arrested for. So here is my straight brothers, you know, all thought he was such a great guy. I'm the one who thought he was an asshole. And I was right. So, but yeah, no, they like helped me not do that and stuff like that. So, I knew all along that was the case. And then the 70s, of course, was the period when gay liberation started in the United States. 1969 was the Stonewall Riot. So I grew up in a time when I was aware that there was a world out there, not my world, but it was there, and that I could find it. Like Anita Bryant, she was this, you know, ex-Miss America, who ran this whole anti-gay campaign. And I remember at one point when I was in junior high, I went on a trip with some friends to San Francisco. And we ended up there during the gay parade. And, so I remember watching the gay parade, and I remember they had these big orange buttons. The 1970s, everybody had buttons. That was a big trend. And she sold orange juice. That was her. She was on the Minute Maid ads. So they had these orange buttons, the size of an orange. And then in blue type, it said, Anita sucks.
What sucks?
Anita Bryant. And I remember, like, it was like, these people are right, she's wrong. Like, they were having a good time, they were nice, they were funny, they were happy, and she was mean and constipated. So like, I knew there was a there, but I knew I couldn't get to it until I got to college. And so then when I got to college, I immediately found the groups, the gay group, and I had a hard transition. The first year, I was very torn, and I had a lot of struggle about it. But once it became clear, you know, that resolved pretty quickly. And then I became very involved, actually, in gay civil rights stuff as a kid, as a college student. And of course, towards the end of my college, I graduated in '86. That was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So I came to New York right at the beginning of HIV. So then AIDS activism immediately pivoted to, gay and lesbian activism pivoted to AIDS activism and ACT UP and all of that. So that was sort of a natural transition for me. And that's ultimately how I ended up going into medicine, was through HIV.
You said that you were conflicted while in the first year of college, right?
Uh-huh.
But you also said that you had a boyfriend in high school.
Right, yeah. I mean, as much as anyone has a boyfriend or girlfriend in high school.
All right. Yeah. No, but you had a boyfriend. You didn't have a girlfriend.
I had a boyfriend, yeah, no, it was, yeah. No, again, I knew I was gay.
Okay. You never had a girlfriend. I mean, you never passed through that process ever.
I mean, when I was in college, I tried.
Okay.
And unsuccessfully.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's conflicted because there's still, I mean, you grow up being told you're abnormal, you're weird, you're messed up. So you grow up not, that's a self-hatred process. And it takes a while to get rid of that. You're brought up to hate yourself. And
to accept yourself for who you are.
Yeah. And that doesn't, and I don't, quite frankly, I don't think that ever really goes away for a lot of people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a whisper in the back of your ear because you're brought up that way, and I think it's very hard not to be. I mean, everything in society is geared towards heterosexuality.
Yeah.
That's where all the messaging is, So I think it's better today, certainly in the U.S. It's a lot easier to find positive gay imagery. I do think kids today, particularly if they grow up in urban areas and stuff, they can grow up with less of that torment. But yeah, that was a big part of, I guess, adolescence for me.
So was school difficult from that angle? Because would your friends and would people around you in class have an inkling of what was that the kind of conflict that you were going through? I mean, from a sexuality point of view.
Well, even before I came out, I was already identified with a more progressive, out there crowd. Bowdoin had fraternities, which are, I think, a bad idea, but nonetheless, they existed. And so I joined the lefty, fluffy, sissy fraternity, Alpha Rho Upsilon, all races united. It was actually founded when Jews weren't allowed to join other fraternities. So I guess in the 50s or something like that. And then just grew up to be sort of the inclusive, we used to refer to ourselves as the land of misfit toys. Which is an allusion to a children's movie. And so I was already part of that crowd when I came out. So when I came out, I was coming out to people who were already out. So that made the transition a lot easier. I didn't have to change friends when I was in college.
Didn't you gravitate towards those kind of friends because of
obviously they were accepting and different. Yeah.
So okay. Mm-hmm. So how was college like? I mean, once all this happened and you were part of all this debate clubs
I loved it.
It was fun.
Yeah, I really loved college. I had a great time. I think the education was fabulous. I had really supportive professors, really got to explore the world. I mean, college was so eye-opening. There's so many dimensions to the world that I was completely oblivious to. I loved it. It was a very, very positive experience.
And you also had a lot of exposure to computers, right? I mean, around this time.
Yes, no, because computers that was still the mainframe era, and the 80s was the introduction of the mini computer. So, Bowdoin got its first VAX when I was there, which was an early mini computer. The buildings weren't networked. Only certain people were really exposed to it. But I was in the crowd that was. But I was primed for it because my father, again, was a computer science teacher. So, we had a computer when I was growing up.
At home?
At home. In fact, it's a sort of a quip that I like to say is that, in the 1970s, nobody had a computer in their house, but we did. So we were on food stamps, we were on government assistance, but we had a computer.
Computer at home.
But it wasn't a computer that you would recognize today. It was a teletype.
Of course.
And it connected to, some mainframe at Dartmouth, apparently. So I grew up with that as an exposure. So it didn't seem strange and alien to me, and I was very excited by it. Unfortunately, the first computers that we bought were at Bowdoin were CPM machines, which was an early operating system. And then when it was clear that CPM was going away in favor of MS-DOS, in favor of DOS, we bought the wrong version of DOS. We had, Digital Equipment Corporation was a big deal in those days, and we bought Digital's DOS rather than Microsoft DOS. So I learned the wrong version, it's all the same. So I grew up in that. That was in the psychology department. That was this guy, Paul Schaffner, my mentor there, he was great. And he would just, give me something to do and then leave me to sort of figure out how to make it work. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I'd have to read the manuals and play around, and that was it never even occurred to me that was unusual. But it was a great way to learn.
Of course.
And of course, it was simpler to do it in those days, I think, because things weren't quite as complicated as they are now. And then when I moved to New York to go to graduate school, it kind of repeated itself because I had to work when I was in graduate school, and I worked for the head of financial aid, or I guess he was, I don't know, maybe he was like the CFO or something. I don't know. He was some financial guy, and Lotus 123 had just come out, and so he handed me the box. And it's like, learn this. This is the new thing.
New thing.
Yeah. And he handed me a copy of, I got 4 programs. Javelin, which was a early spreadsheet system that competed with Lotus Notes. DBase, one of the early database programs. And Novell. So I had to set up a bunch of computers using the Novell networking protocol. God, what a mess it was! And that was when you had those the 5.25-inch floppies, and you needed to have one that had the security key on it for everything to boot. And if one was missing, the whole network would fail. It was so badly designed. It's amazing. Not surprising that company doesn't exist anymore. Amazing that it succeeded as well as it did. But I learned a lot, again, just from the manuals, trying to figure it out.
But your education was in history, right? I mean, and yet you were interested.
I went to graduate school in psychology.
In psychology, yeah.
Yeah.
You also studied a lot of history, you said, and
yes, yeah.
so this has nothing to do with computers at all. I mean,
No,
not at all. So
not
you're
at all.
basically a self-learner, and today you're like the CIO of
Cornell medicine.
Yeah. So I mean, how do you see this
How
journey?
do I connect the dots?
Yeah. How do you connect the dots?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just condensing what happened next.
No, don't condense. Ramble.
All right. Well, I left. I did not like graduate school.
Okay.
So I was in a program that was way too Freudian, and
Freudian. I mean, what?
It was a clinical psychology program.
Okay.
And,
Okay.
and it was way too Freudian. Okay. And there was a group there that was more progressive, cognitive behavioral, but the woman who led that was missing the charisma gene, and it just didn't click for me. And they were very full of themselves, and they also didn't give me as much money as they promised. You know, they were supposed to. When I got there, the scholarship that they had offered magically disappeared. So it was a real stretch for me to be there. So I took a leave of absence, and again, this was when AIDS was starting. So I worked as a research assistant on an early AIDS project. It was HIV hadn't been named yet, and it was actually a fascinating project. The New York Blood Center, which is the blood bank for the city of New York, has a research lab where they had developed the hepatitis B vaccine. And a hepatitis B vaccine was made from human plasma in those days. Now it's made through a recombinant method, but in those days it was made from plasma. And hepatitis B had been very common in the gay community. And so in order to make the vaccine, men would come in and donate plasma. And they could donate every couple days because you regenerate your plasma very quickly. And many of them did. And every time they donated, they stored a vial of blood. So when HIV hit, they went back to the freezer, and they could tell to the week that these men seroconverted. So the study was a natural history of the progression of HIV. I was involved in interviewing the men about their sex practices and educating them about safer sex. And it was a fabulous exposure to how research worked, and it mercifully works a lot better today than it used to. Like I had the ability to go into the database and just do my own analyses, which is kind of horrifying. But I learned a lot of cool stuff. And and while I was there, the people that I was exposed to really said, you should go be a doctor. Don't go to PhD, get an MD. At that point, I had met my husband. So my boss actually was his best friend.
Okay.
And he's older than me, but he had likewise finished college and decided to be a doctor later. And he had gone to Columbia to do what they call a post-baccalaureate pre-med program, which I didn't even know existed. And he said, do that. So I did that. So while I was working at Sloan Kettering on this AIDS project, I went back to college and I did pre-med again. And Sloan Kettering paid for it.
It's like you went back to a graduation program, right?
It's an undergraduate program, but it's post-baccalaureate. So, and you're mixed with all the other
that would be jargon,
students.
right? I mean, it's like because you had no experience in medicine, you had in psychology, right? I mean,
Right. So this was all the pre-med stuff. So it's
like pre-med,
biology,
right?
physics, chemistry. I had to take all of that again because I didn't do it in college. So I did it, and this time around, I loved it. At this point, I was much more mature.
Even the physics.
I loved physics, actually. I mean, part of it is I realized in retrospect that the physics professor at Bowdoin was terrible, and the physics professor at Columbia was awesome. But he just was engaging and interesting and fun. But I was able to really just focus on the science part, and I didn't have the rest of my life to worry about the way I did in college, where I was trying to figure out who I was and all this other stuff. So I was able to be a much better student, and I really loved it. So then I went to medical school, and I went to Cornell, and Cornell at the time was known as being very progressive in terms of computerized education.
Okay.
So, which very much appealed to me. So they had this new thing, the Education Center, where they were building out digital tools for teaching medicine. And I met a couple of really important people there, one of whom, a woman who ran the Ed Center, named Suzanne Stensis, is a very charismatic individual. So I would just go and work with her on whatever it was she was doing. So there's a famous textbook of pathology called Robbins, which everyone in medicine knows Robbins. And it's sort of a juggernaut of medical education. And Cornell had gotten permission to create a digital version of Robbins. So my part was taking things like images and, going into, I don't know if it was Photoshop, I don't know, something equivalent, and doing the masking and stuff to get it ready for publication. And then while I was there, this thing called the internet was invented. You may have heard of it. And that, of course,
somewhat.
changed.
I'm actually learning. Yeah.
And that changed everything. So suddenly we had Netscape and...
and you had shared resources. I mean, that's the whole thing about the internet. Yeah.
So I got very wrapped up in that crowd. And so then when I became a resident, the head of my residency was a very senior physician. He's really one of the most important mentors of my life. His name is Joe Hayes. He's just sort of a god of medicine. He's just was an amazing clinician and a brilliant teacher. And I used to tease him later in life. Whenever there was really something horrible to do at the hospital, they would call Joe because he had the credibility to be able to talk to other doctors to tell them you have to change. So when they changed the reimbursement model for physicians, it was Joe who had to do that. And so I used to refer to him as the dean of shit. One of the horrible things that came was they decided they were going to install an electronic medical record. And nobody knew anything about it. And I was well known to be a computer nerd. And so Joe said to the leadership of the hospital, if you're going to do this, you need to hire some doctors who know something about computers. Here's a kid. And there were a couple of others that he named. He said, you need to hire these guys. And so I did what's called short tracking. So I traded my third year of residency for 2 years of this self-designed informatics fellowship, where basically my job was helping to implement the first EHR at the hospital. And that was sort of how I got into the IT world.
Okay.
I learned an incredible amount during those years. So that's how it comes together to me. So to me, the informatics and the medicine come together very naturally. And I'm very interested in how to make the computers work better for doctors, work better for patients. And then if you get deeply involved in that, you see how the EMR is just part of a broader context of the overall information system architecture. And so that's how I became interested in that, and it always just keeps getting larger and larger. But it all fits together to me, at least in my brain.
But I feel that it's also somewhere destiny, in the sense that you had a computer at home, your father was a computer science professor, and you were still trying to probably, you were just there, but you didn't still take up computers. Like, you would have always studied computer science, but you didn't do that. You went in for psychology and history, and but somehow it kept pulling you back into to do computers.
Well, I'm very interested in, I think I've always been attracted to sort of the nexus of different fields, where two fields collide. I think it's not an accident that my specialty in medicine is general internal medicine. So in general internal medicine, have to know a little bit about a lot. It's a very, very, very broad field. Right. And then, if you really want to know deeply about one thing, well, then you subspecialize in cardiology or pulmonology or whatever. I'm a generalist. I like seeing how a lot of different things work, and then figuring out how do you make them work together. That's what appeals to me.
So, and how was, because this seems like a very expensive endeavor. I mean, this whole thing about going to, how was all this getting paid? I mean, how did you manage to?
My education, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, in those days, if you worked for a hospital or an academic institution, one of the benefits was tuition. So when I was working for the Blood Center and for Sloan Kettering, I had a tuition benefit. So all of the courses that I took at Columbia, they paid. So I didn't accumulate any debt for my pre-med experience. And then when I got into Cornell, Cornell had very good financial aid. And so I didn't get exactly a free ride, but I paid very little. At that point, I was living with my now husband, so I wasn't paying room and board. It was very important to me that he not pay my tuition bills, but I was happy to have him pay my rent. So
that's how.
So that's how I did it. Yeah.
So, how do you look at education today? Because I think there's always this, even here, I mean, here in India, you always hear about student debt in the US and how crippling it can be, and how you never really get out of it for decades. I mean, so, and then if you lose a job, and then it's so what are your views on all this now? Well, on what is happening now, and how to, what can be done?
It's a complicated problem. I think universities charge too much is one of the biggest problems. And the reason they charge too much is because they can. And the reason they can is because we built this system that allows students to borrow money with a government guarantee. And so we created this monster, and now we don't know how to break the cycle. Tuition is just too high. It just plain is too high. And I find, I think it's the Danish system where education is free, and in fact you even get a stipend in order to study. I find that very appealing.
Scandinavia, I think has that.
And that, but it's hard to know whether that would scale to a society as diverse and complex as the U.S. You know, Scandinavian countries are pretty homogenous, and the countries are small and very wealthy. They don't. So would that work here? I think they also, I think, probably are much better at regulating universities. So, you know, when this gravy train of high tuition, high debt grew, a lot of unscrupulous schools opened and started selling bullshit educations to kids who were suckered into them. I mean, Trump University is just an extreme example of that. But, you know, pretty much, who was that head of education that we had under Trump, that nightmare rich woman? And, you know, she was just all about promoting these terrible private colleges. And like Brazil, I don't know what it's like here in India, but in Brazil, that's a big problem. The federal universities are the best and they're free. And then they have private universities that suck, and kids pay a ton of money to go there and they get a lousy education. So I think you can't just make education free if the education itself is terrible.
Right. Right.
And it's very hard to impose standards in the United States because we have this sort of poorly defined notion of freedom. And even liberals, you know, will say, you know, they'll be the first to say, you can't, you know, who are you to define the canon, you know? And if no one's making the definition, if there is no paternalism, then you can't maintain standards.
Right.
And I get it. If you have the wrong people making the standards, then you will lock out groups of people that are and ideas that need to be taught.
Right.
So I don't know what the magic bullet is, but I do think that a traditional liberal education is better at incorporating a broad group of ideas. And I also would say that a traditional technical education would be good too. We have a problem right now in our family. One of the kids wants to go to a technical college, and he lives or school actually. He's a high school student in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a small state in New England that has very low taxes, and as a result, they have terrible schools because there's no money, and they don't have in all of the state of New Hampshire, there's not a single technical school that the kids can go to. It's crazy. You know, why shouldn't you as a high school student be able to choose a technical track? We have a desperate need for plumbers and electricians and, you know, HVAC technicians in the United States, but we don't have any training programs for them.
Right. That's true even here, actually. Yeah.
So I don't know what the answer is. I do think it needs to be cheaper. I do think it would be better if it was paid for by taxes. But I also think you have to have quality control imposed somehow.
This is all very, I mean, within my limited worldview, I mean, this is all very similar to the way insurance also works, you know, that everything is getting very, even in India by itself, because it's a huge country, and just because the insurance is there, the doctors will, you know, keep on the charging you.
Yeah.
You know, so what is something that without insurance you can get done for, like, say, in India, for say $500, you'll suddenly see on the bill when it's billed to the insurance company, it's around $5,000.
Right,
It happens. It's happening right now. I've seen it, you know, myself. So it's a little. I think that's exactly how education also is. But like even if you are, say, dumb, like not really fit to be a doctor, you can be a doctor in this country if you have, say, it's 150,000 US, you know, dollars. So you can easily become a doctor in this country. So that's exactly how. I mean, it's that's how you're bad doctors, I guess.
Well, there's a famous economist in the United States. He's dead now, named U.V. Reinhardt, and he wrote a very famous essay called "It's the Price is Stupid."
It's the price is stupid.
And he basically, you know, everyone gnashes their teeth around how complicated healthcare economics is. And healthcare economics is incredibly complicated. There's no doubt about it. But in the United States, if you're going to pick one problem, the biggest problem that we have driving healthcare costs up is prices.
Prices.
The prices are too high. And that's what we need to stop. Okay, and it sounds like that's now repeating itself in India, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I'll have to read more about that. That sounds fascinating.
And so how did it go from here? I mean, once you graduated, you finished your college, I mean, you were a doctor. And then what happened? How did you land up where you are right now? I mean, what is the path that you went
Well,
through?
I got on that train and I never really got off. After I finished my training program, even before I finished, actually, I already had a job at Cornell to implement the electronic medical record at Cornell. So I developed the clinical IT group there, which grew to be quite large. And we took a long time, but we did ultimately implement the EHR. And I was lucky enough to recruit some really amazing people along the way. And we did some very innovative things. We really pushed the limits of what the software could do. And I think we made some significant contributions, which I'm very proud of. I guess about 10 years after doing that, then I was asked to be the chief information officer. So at that point, I had to take on the research systems, the educational systems, the administrative systems as well. Very different challenge. The timing of that transition turned out to be very good for me because the EHR had sort of already been implemented, and I was really very interested in what you could do with the data that came out of the EHR. So my work really pivoted more towards building the databases, the extracts from the EHR, and making them more available for research. Now I had the responsibility for all these other systems as well, but we all know that the administrative systems were actually run by your friend Vipin. He took care of that. I was able to recruit, in all the areas of my department, I've really been able to recruit some outstanding people to actually lead those, which leaves me, the ability to figure out, the integrations and the next steps, which is very fun. And more recently, I've gotten to actually work a lot with students. So we opened a new engineering school in New York. I don't think it's 10 years ago, and called Cornell Tech. And I was lucky enough to meet some of the people who started their healthcare technology group even before they actually came to Cornell. And so I've been connected to them from the very beginning. And so I get to bring students into the IT department who have new ideas and ask fresh questions. And then they build healthcare companies, healthcare IT companies. And so that's been another sort of virtuous cycle, I think, that we've built in our team, which has been incredibly rewarding for me. That's a lot of fun.
So you're like, in a way, creating entrepreneurs. I mean, that's the...
Yeah, and it's, I'm essentially trying to pay back what I had. I had these great mentors who let me do stuff. Gave me access to data, gave me access to systems, answered questions, but let me actually sort of go in the direction that I wanted to go. I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to do for people, and it's very rewarding as a professor to be able to do that, because the students will always surprise you.
Yeah.
And what they can accomplish. It's quite amazing. So.
And what kind of a mentor have you been? I mean, I'm told that there is a certain side of you which leans towards philanthropy pretty much. So, what exactly? I mean, how?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, but for the student, the students in the tech program. The mentoring is, there's kind of a formula. if you will, which is that they are really looking for reality testing. So they come with an idea. Most of the ideas are not new ideas. And so you give them harsh feedback very early. And it's, you don't want to be mean about it, but the point, you want to kindly point out
What is missing?
what is missing. Like, okay, this is not a new idea. So what is your angle going to be? How are you going to make this different? Okay, that is a new idea. Okay, so why don't you run with that? What's the market? Brilliant idea, brilliant function. How are you going to pay for it? So it's a lot of it is asking questions and, often guiding them to an answer, but you definitely want them to find the answer on their own. But that's at least what I try to do.
So this is on the side of your job, right? I mean, this is like, but outside of it also, I think you try to do a lot, don't you? I mean,
Well, I've been on the boards of a couple charitable organizations. Right now, I'm on the board of something called the Medicare Rights Center,
okay.
which is they're an amazing group. They're sort of the leading non-governmental organization that provides support services as well as sort of government advice, if you will, not exactly lobbying, around Medicare. So they do a couple things. They have a phone call center where if you have a problem with Medicare, you can call them and they'll help you resolve the problem. And then they train people in how Medicare works. So they train professionals. And in fact, Medicare itself sends their employees to the Medicare Rights Center to learn how Medicare works. And then they have this policy arm that develops new proposals, laws, regulations to try to improve Medicare. So, for example, they just had a big success federally in something called the Bennies Act. If you, in the United States, when you become eligible for Medicare, the government doesn't tell you you're eligible.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And if you...
Why is that? I mean,
they're not required to, so they don't. And if you don't enroll at the right time, there's actually penalties that you pay for the rest of your life. Like, so it's a really stupid system. So they got this law. They got the law changed so that Medicare has to tell you that you are now eligible. And then similarly, they just had a big victory in the state of New York, where they were able to change eligibility for what are called shared savings plans, which will make Medicare much more affordable for a whole bunch of underserved people. Medicare is expensive. People often forget. Yes, it's a government program, but you still have to pay to be in it, and it is very expensive.
wow. So I just want to get back to when AIDS was really a big thing in the U.S. and it did affect you. I mean at a personal level. I mean, as a,
Yes, yeah.
So can you talk about that a little and how I think you also set up centers and you also were helping out people at that point when that whole experience was pretty.
Well, when I started practicing medicine, I had two practices. I had a general internal medicine practice, and then I worked in an AIDS clinic.
Okay.
So half of my time was just taking care of AIDS patients. Luckily, highly active antiretroviral therapy was invented, and that part of my practice felt less urgent at about the same time that my informatics work was getting bigger and bigger. So as I have gotten older, I've had to give up more and more of my practice. So the AIDS clinic was far from the hospital. It was the other side of the city. And so it was really hard for me to go there. So that was the first thing I gave up. Yes, I did do direct AIDS care early in my career. I was not part of that first wave of doctors, though. I was still working at Memorial and the Blood Center, and then going to medical school and stuff during the early years of the epidemic. So I wasn't part of that group. Those doctors were a very special group of people who really sort of changed the world. I think my husband was really more part of that crew. He helped set up the first pediatric AIDS clinic at Cornell, and he took care of a lot of dying kids. But certainly that experience of growing up in that era definitely affected how I look at the world. When I was in my 20s, a lot of my friends were dying. Yeah, and, they're dead now. And that's not an experience that most people have in their 20s.
Right.
It's a period when people are doing a lot of dating and that was
and
all
they were dying
very
terrible deaths.
dangerous, and the terrible deaths, wasting away. It was a horrible time. And it's been interesting going through COVID and seeing the parallels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now, of course, we have monkeypox, which in many ways has even more parallels. People aren't dying of monkeypox, mercifully, and people were dying of COVID, but still are. But the fact that we never learn. We never learn from our mistakes, and we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Monkeypox did not need to be the little mini epidemic that it is. We have drugs that treat monkeypox. We're failing to get them to the people who need them. We have vaccines that prevent it. We're failing to get it to the people who need them. COVID. We just went through COVID where,
How old is monkeypox actually? As a discovery,
I think it was discovered first, I want to say 1970. It might have been 1950 or something, but it's a new disease.
It's a new disease.
Yeah. It was first found in Africa, I want to say Congo, in primarily people who work with animals. So either they took care of animals or they hunted animals or something like that. And periodically there would be outbreaks in a village or something, and typically it was with the men who were interacting with the animals, and then it would spread to the women who were taking care of the sick men. But it would peter out. They'd have a little mini epidemic, and then it would go away. And then something changed around 2017, 2018, something like that. And there's one Nigerian.
Something changed in the virus.
In the virus, yeah. And
mutated.
It probably mutated. There are already two versions that we knew about. One was a more fatal version, which we don't see a lot. And then there was the newer version, and then this 2017. We think that's a whole new version, but I'm not sure they know for sure. But it certainly behaves differently. And there was one doctor in Nigeria, I think, who wrote about it, that this new version was spreading among young men. And of course, it was said to be heterosexual men, but homosexuality is illegal there. So, of course, they're going to say that they're heterosexual. And no one did anything because it's, it's Africa. One of the really tragic things, the United States had 20 million, or Denmark, I don't know, someone had 20 million doses of a vaccine that could have prevented it, that they let expire. Wow. Rather than send it to Africa and stamp out the disease. What is wrong with these people? So it definitely, is an epidemic that did not need to happen. And then much like AIDS, came out of Central Africa, and then spread to the world. Both of those diseases seem to be spreading, primarily through the gay community. Of course, HIV initially then spread everywhere, and monkeypox. Who knows what's going to happen to it next? It's a very, very different virus. It doesn't mutate as fast as HIV or COVID. Different kind of virus. So hopefully it will not mutate. And maybe we do have a shot at stamping it out. But will we learn from this epidemic? Like, will we start vaccinating people against smallpox again or whatever? I don't know. We need to do something, clearly, that we're not doing.
Okay, so personally for you, I mean, you are at the age which you're at the other side of 50s now, so I guess.
Uh-huh.
So where to from here? How do you look at the world now, and how does that perspective change from being a young man? I mean, how does that perspective change too? Because you are also at the forefront of technology in a way,
Uh-huh.
and you're at the forefront of medicine. So it's a kind of area which is very, very important, very relevant to the world today. So where do you see? How do you see this? How do you see the world, and how do you see that we can make this better?
Well, I wish I had a good answer to that question. It is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and have not actually come to a resolution as to what the right path forward is. I don't think it helps to be pessimistic. It doesn't solve anything for anyone, it just makes you feel bad. So I do want to be focused on solutions. But I am not sanguine about the solution set that we have right now. The biggest problem is climate change, and everything else that we're talking about is subservient to that, or subsidiary to that. And I do think that needs to be the dominant way that we view all other problems. It has to be through that lens. In the 1970s, when I was growing up, there was a big movement around zero population growth, ZPG. And I don't understand what happened to that. That's obviously what we need to be talking about. And
what is ZPC? I mean,
ZPG, zero population growth. Well, China actually had it as a policy where, people were not allowed to have more than one child. As that as a species, that's what we need to pursue. There are 8 billion people on the planet right now, and I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding from what I've read is that the globe cannot support really more than 4 or 5 million in a sustainable way. So we have to have fewer people. And no one wants to talk about that. And I find it baffling because when I was growing up, we did talk about it. And we talked about it enough that actually China made it a national policy. And if anything, we've made it much worse in the United States. Now it's much harder to adopt than it used to be. We now spend gazillions of dollars on infertility treatments, which to me are fundamentally racist. And I just don't understand why the language of racism is not allowed to be used in the context of population. If there are too many unwanted children in the world, why do you have to have your own? Because of racism, because you want the kid to look like you. There's nothing possibly more racist than that. I don't have kids, and so, people say, well, I'll never know the magic of what it is to have a child. All right, well, are your children going to know the magic of having a child if the globe ends? If the planet can't sustain the kid? We have a lot of adopted kids in my family, and are they any less part of our family because, their genetics are different? I really don't think so. So to me, I don't personally know how to contribute to that. I really don't, other than not having kids. So, but to me, I feel like that's what the future needs to be focused on, is how do we deal with overpopulation of the planet? And the stuff that I do is trivial in comparison to that as a problem. Sorry, that was very depressing, wasn't it?
No. I just want to. I'm just trying to understand this. I mean, in the sense that, isn't it slightly contradictory with the liberal point of view, as that people can do what they want and have.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
But see, I don't
because
believe.
China even today, if China today is suffering in the sense that now the young don't want to have children anymore. So it's
right, yeah.
So it's,
and there's this, and the transition to we've in the 20th century, probably before that, all economic models were really based on the notion that growth is good.
Growth is good, right?
And so maybe this will be how we tie it to computer science and health. How do we create an economy where contraction is good? So we have to alter the incentives to make smaller attractive.
But I think then there has to be more equitable distribution, of wealth. Yeah. Because what was done in India, for example, in 1993, around when the whole economic process, when India, it seems, blasted through, is that they said that there is something called as trickle-down economics.
Yes.
So just that the rich became richer, and if they had something to spare, then it went down to all of us, to the rest of the country. Yeah. But the moment that tap dried out, obviously the first people who suffered were the 80% down. Yeah. So that's how.
Yeah, and that's also something I think that's been kind of interesting to watch in my childhood. Is like growing up, inequality was not nearly as bad.
Right. I agree.
And we're talking about my childhood and my being aware of other kids being rich. Okay, well, but in the 1970s, if you looked at how much a CEO made, someone who was rich, who drove a Cadillac. I remember when Cadillacs were a status symbol. They maybe made 10 times more than the lowest paid person.
Lowest paid employee.
Now it's like completely out of whack. The head of our hospital makes something like $14 million a year. That's insane to run a non-profit charitable corporation. That's absolutely insane. So, I also believe, I totally agree with you that inequality is a huge problem. And I personally think there are two key solutions to that problem. One, learn from the British and impose essentially 100% inheritance tax. It can't be 100%. You have to be able to leave something. I just don't, this notion that you can leave millions and millions. Look at Donald Trump's children. Do they deserve anything? No. They're hideous human beings. They accomplished nothing in life. Why should they be given money?
But isn't that up to Trump? I'm just...
No, because what rich person has money completely due to their own...
very few. Not what rich person, but very few.
Name one who did it really on their own. Elon Musk started as a rich person. Yeah, and he's done a lot of horrible things as a human being in order to make the money that he made. Okay, everybody, and he gets there. His cars run on the roads that our taxes pay for. Okay, so he did not get there on his own. Nobody did. Okay, and so I don't think it's wrong. Okay, let him have a lot of fun while he's alive. Let him, leave, even a few $1 million or whatever to his kids. But most of it, the billions, need to go back to society. And if he wants to give it away before he dies and control where the money goes, knock himself out. Okay, be Nelson, be a Rockefeller. Okay, give the money away. But it has to go away. You can't, otherwise you create autocracy. You create an aristocracy. So you have to tax people. Otherwise, you reward idiocy. Because that's what an inheritance tax is a reward for nothing. Choosing your parents well. Right? That's,
I mean, that's an accident of birth too.
Exactly. It's completely ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. And any liberal society that believes in meritocracy cannot believe in inherited wealth. The two are completely against one another. And then I do believe also in very high taxation during life. And I think the problem that we have in the United States, and I think this is true in India as well, is that our governments don't have a good history of spending money well.
Right.
Now, in India, it's a different kind of problem than it is in the United States, but the problem is still the same. No one is going to favor taxes if the money is poorly spent. So in the United States, we spend most of our money blowing up other countries. And that's where our taxes go to. In Europe, most of the money goes to well-being. So the United States, our government spends as much money on healthcare as European governments do. But that's only half of the amount of money that we spend on healthcare in the United States because it's spent so badly. And because the prices are too high, but going back to that earlier conversation. But so you have to have a government that can effectively spend money. And I do think that that's harder in large pluralistic societies, which of course India is as well. And I don't know, I'm not a political scientist, I don't know how you solve that problem. But I don't think people should be able to, people wouldn't resent taxes if it got them good services.
Right. One thing which you said here, earlier on, which was about you going to a school where there were far richer kids, and so I have had a very similar experience in this context. This is because I came from a lower middle class kind of background, and we used to live in a house which was like 200 to 300 square feet, about 6 or 7 of us, and all that. But I also went to a school which was a lower class school. So what I realized in life was that what you don't have doesn't really bother you till you see others having it.
Right. And boy, has the internet messed that up, because now everybody gets to see.
Has that thing.
Everybody can see what others have.
Right. And like when I went to college and I suddenly had, people who had far bigger houses, and they had like a friend had resorts. He had 5 resorts, big resorts. I mean, like, and parents were far well educated. My parents are not really educated at all. So they've had they've led the hard life. They obviously gave me everything that they could. But I'm saying that, but what I realized in far earlier was that what you don't have doesn't bother you at all. You don't care.
Right.
You just don't care whether somebody has a bigger house. You may see that building when you're going in a train or a bus, but you don't know what that life is and what that lifestyle is all about.
Yep.
So it doesn't bother you at all. I mean, that's what. And even for the children thing, I think that is what is happening now. At least what I feel all over the world. At least I don't know how it happens in the US, but in India, at least what I see is that people are having less children because inflation is killing almost every kind of desire that is. You just can't afford to have children anymore.
Right.
It's like, because you already want a lot out of life, because the kind of things that you are aware of and you have, you can see them around you. But and children take away a major part of that. So I see a lot of my friends also who have money not really have more than 1 or 2 children. That's which wouldn't have happened, was not happening, say, 30, 40 years away back. So this is more or less. So let's try and wrap it up with something which we really haven't discussed, and which is a little more personal and probably, hopefully, more fun. So what is your love story?
Well, my husband's name is Ladd, and he's also a doctor. He's a psychiatrist, and he's an artist. And he was finishing his fellowship about the time that I met him. I like to tease him that his best friend was my boss, and I was, the research assistant, and Lad dated all of his research assistants. I'm just the one who's stuck. So Lad and I hit it off very quickly.
This was in what year? I mean, if it's
1987.
Wow,
Yeah. So we met, I think, in January of 87.
that's almost 35 years.
Yeah. I think we went to a movie once in January.
What movie was it?
Blue Velvet.
Okay,
It was really cold. That was a really, really cold winter.
that's an art film. I mean,
I'm sorry?
that's an art film. That's
Yeah,
a very arty film.
It's a really creepy movie.
Yeah.
And then we went out to dinner February 11th.
1987.
Yeah, it was super, and it was incredibly cold. And Lad lived in the building that I worked in.
Okay.
And I lived in Brooklyn, 3 trains away. And this was before New York City had fixed the subways. So it was 3 old trains away, and it was really cold. And so he invited me to stay over. And essentially, I never left. I mean, I basically moved in for all practical purposes within
The
a few
lodging and the
months.
boarding was getting taken care of. Come on.
So, no, but we really do. We're very compatible in strange ways. He's a really wonderful person. He's incredibly smart and incredibly funny. He, I don't know, he somehow puts up with me, and I somehow put up with him. We had, we had a great few years early on, and then we had a rough spot about 7 years in, so-called 7-year itch, right? And that was when I was a resident. And luckily, as a resident at New York Hospital, you actually have to live at the hospital. So I had my own apartment when I was a resident, and that turned out to be a good experience. And I realized in retrospect, actually, we went to couples counseling, and I'll never forget the psychologist who saw us when she asked a question that like totally changed my life. And she said, "Did you ever have your own room?"
She asked you.
She asked me when I was growing up, "Did you ever have your own room?" And it was then that I realized that what was really bothering me was a lack of my own space. So having that apartment, really solved a lot of problems for us. And then, of course, I was very happy to ditch the apartment as soon as I could. And when I did, we created an office for me at home. And Lad wasn't allowed to touch it. And it was my own little hovel filled with all of my garbage. And it really turned around our relationship. And it's been great ever since. Really fabulous. I mean, every year is better. So
I don't think too many marriages can say that every year is better.
I feel incredibly lucky to have him. He's just a wonderful human being. We're going through an interesting period now in that he's getting ready to retire because he is older than me.
Right.
And I'm not really ready to retire. But I don't really want to work, 70, 80 hours a week if he's at home. I think that would drive me crazy. I would die of jealousy, and he would probably be texting me about things that would drive me nuts. So we've got to figure that out.
It would be like he would be a house husband, who doesn't go out anywhere. So
Yeah.
don't really want to be in that.
No, he'll keep himself busy, I'm sure. But it's interesting. He was kind of gearing down, and then COVID hit.
Yeah,
And,
right.
And he sort of really got his mojo back. He really, again, like AIDS, there was just a huge shortage of child psychiatrists who would actually see patients. It made him very angry to see his peers refusing to really take care of people. And so his practice, he started to take on patients and see more patients than usual, not gearing down as he was. And he's really, it's been great for him. He's had a really good experience, and and now, of course, when you're a senior clinician, he has a private practice, and so he can sort of just pick and choose who he wants to see, and he doesn't worry whether or not they can't pay. It's sort of, is this an interesting case? Does this person really need me? It's nice to watch. So.
Did he have a similar kind of background like yours? I mean, as a child, and was it more privileged, or was it more struggle, or what was it like? I mean, I'm just asking because I just want to understand how was it that you two relate fundamentally. I mean, as the way you've grown up and.
Well, I mean, we certainly both grew up in similar worlds, but his was very different in some critical ways. He's the middle of three boys, and his parents are very different than my parents. His father was an attorney, and a very, very well-known attorney who made a name for himself defending small towns from large power companies when the United States electric grid was being set up. And he kind of invented a whole field of law. And he was a character. He had this whole image as sort of a bumbling small town lawyer, but he was actually sharp as a tack, and it was all an act to just throw people off. He was a character. He's an interesting guy. And then his mother was very cerebral. She was just incredibly smart, and she had no business being a housewife in the 1950s. Like, that was just a bad fit for her, and it took a while for her to realize that. But then she finally went to work she was a book editor.
Okay.
And she actually ultimately became the managing editor of a publishing house. But she was a real genuine intellectual, and they were very liberal, and she was really interested in child development. So she took on parenting as sort of like an intellectual act. So creativity was completely encouraged in their house. So while my childhood was all about rules, and literally when I was growing up, at one point we had 3 bunk beds, and we would stand next to the bunk bed at attention, like we were in a barracks, and my father would inspect the bed. It was that like sort of...
Because he was in the army.
Yeah, it was like sort of silliness. Whereas, he grew up into a house where if you broke something, no one cared. It was like, oh, well, he was creating something. So, like, it was, accidents happen, so very, very much more supportive environment. But so loose that it lacked structure. So he, and his brothers were pretty tough as kids. They both had different kinds of problems. So he sort of escaped the family and spent a lot of time at aunts and uncles and at neighbors and stuff like that, and was very eager to get out of the house. And he was very artistic even as a kid, and so he sort of pursued an art career for a while, and I don't quite know how he got into psychiatry, but at some point he decided, I think maybe he was in analysis when he was in college.
He was in?
Was in analysis, psychoanalysis. Yeah, as a patient.
Okay.
And I think that was... how he learned about psychiatry as a field or whatever. And then he went to this very cool program at the University of Maryland where you were admitted as a medical student knowing that you were going to be a psychiatrist. So it was a special track within the medical school for students who were destined for psychiatry. And they took slightly non-traditional students, which he was. And then he did his residency at Cornell, Payne Whitney, and when he finished, that was when he was he ran what's called the consult liaison service, which is when psychiatrists see medical patients, and he was running that, and that was at the time that they were forming the AIDS unit, which is when we met.
Wow.
So
I didn't ask you this, but your sisters were very supportive of you when you came out to be gay. But how was it with your brothers and your parents? Was it different?
yeah, I mean, my father, who was very conservative and strict and yelled a lot, and at the end of the day, he was actually, he's a teacher, school teacher. He was and he was supportive of kids. So he was actually not a problem. I was afraid of him, but he wasn't really a problem. My mother never accepted it, ever.
Even now?
Even now, yeah. She's nasty about it. She writes, she doesn't anymore, but she used to write cards and stuff, when are you going to get to know Jesus and stuff, and just...
because she's also very religious.
Yeah, so...
Right.
But, she's pretty much managed to alienate every one of her children. None of us could meet her religious standard. And again, it bothered me...
But the children came out of her.
Yeah. It bothered me more when I was younger. But again, because I had my sister, it never really took that big a toll. Because she really was, it was much more like having a grandmother who disagreed than a mother.
So your sister was your mother in a way. The two sisters, I guess.
Yeah, and my sisters were always supportive. My brothers, for the most part, I don't think really noticed one way or another. They're all older than me, and I didn't really register much on their radar. The brother who's just older than me, he and I we were close as kids, and we fought a lot. We shared rooms all of our life. He and I are very different. I was much more bookish and a good student, and he hated school. He was a little more athletic, much more interested in outdoor activities and stuff. And so we didn't really get along too much as kids. And when I came out, he was actually, I still kind of cry when I hear it. He was probably the warmest of all of my brothers and sisters. And, he said to me, I totally don't understand this. And it doesn't matter. When I think about it, it's kind of disgusting. But then I realize, if you think about me, you probably think I'm disgusting. And all that matters is you're my brother and I love you.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think of all my brothers and sisters, he's the happiest. He's just a really well-developed individual. He was the most, out there as a kid. He fought the system. He got kicked out of school. All of us went to college except him. He kind of fought the system. And, but he found his way in life. And he picked his own path. And I think he's very happy with the choices that he's made. He's built a really great life for himself. And I really, really admire him as an individual. He's a great guy. My oldest brother was an important person to me. Again, a little bit more of a parental figure. He was kind of absent because he, when I was young and he was in high school, he was always working. He's kind of the prince of the family. He was, the golden boy. And I always looked up to him. And he was really nice to me when I was in college. He would, invite me to his house to, have me paint or, I fixed his porch and stuff like that. And it was just getting to see him adulting, was inspiring, because he always had his life really together. He always had a plan, and he was very supportive. When I was first setting up my apartment and stuff, he was a person I could always count on to help me figure something out. Like, how do you do something? How do you get a credit card? Something like that. So, and that he was always really helpful in that way. My second oldest brother, he's an engineer. He's a fellow at Intel, super, super smart, and completely recognizable in my IT world as one of those, slightly aspy, obsessive, completely technical people who's like just sort of like oblivious to the world around him, and just sees the world through an engineering lens. And he was also really supportive of me in my, all my computer supports, and was able to give me good advice about things to learn and people to meet, helped me get some jobs early on, he's just been, he was always very supportive. And then the next brother's the one that I know the least. He lives pretty far away, lives in Texas. He was very important to me when I was very young. He and I shared a room when I was like 4 or 5 or something like that. But when he went to college, and he moved south, and he just was, we just didn't cross much. But we're still in touch. And he has great kids, who themselves have kids, who are really interesting people. All my brothers and sisters are fascinating people, and at the end of the day, they're all good people, which is nice. A lot of amazing accomplishments among the lot. So.
Okay, I just, it comes from my limited understanding of the world, but I'm saying that, and I don't believe it should be any different, but would a game, because you've seen your parents' marriages, and you've seen marriages, other marriages which are normal heterosexual marriages. So is that any different from, say, a gay marriage, and what makes a gay marriage work vis-a-vis the traditional form of marriage that we see?
I'm not an expert in this, but based on my own observation, there's a famous psychoanalyst, Richard Issei, who was at Cornell, and he was a traditionally trained psychoanalyst, but came out as gay later in life. And he made an interesting observation about gay couples, which I think is which I see in other couples, which is that. He says marriages thrive on difference. So, and heterosexual marriages have a built-in difference, which is gender. And so many successful gay marriages, there is something else that is equivalent to gender that is a difference. So in my case, it's age. In others, it's often race, it may be religion. But often you find people who have you find couples that have some kind of difference, which allow for a productive tension in the marriage. So I think that's an interesting observation that I think is often true. Now, there's often, I see plenty of couples that are not different, that seem like they're very alike.
Have they lasted the way you have? I mean, it's like...
I think the characteristic that I find most common in certainly gay male couples that have lasted forever is a sense of acceptance. And I think, in order to be a gay couple, you have to work at it. Like it's not, it's not the automatic path. Like, so, so that lived experience of otherness, I think the positive aspect of that is that in a coupled relationship, tolerance of one another I think is often a little bit easier. And, there are things about Lad which just drive me completely insane. But long ago, I accepted that those things are never going to change. And the converse is true. That allowing, just writing that off
Right.
and just focusing on what is positive and what is good, I think is really helpful. I think one thing that I think a lot of gay couples have that I think is less common in straight couples is less jealousy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I see a lot. I mean, I certainly see gay couples who have a lot of jealousy, but
Gay couples are more jealous.
less jealous.
Are less jealous. Okay.
Now, again, I think this is more common among men than women. I think gay women have different kind of relationships as a stereotype. I mean, all of these things are gross generalizations. But I think gay women and gay men have very different kinds of relationships for different reasons. But I do think gay men, long successful gay male couples are typically less jealous of one another, less protective of each other's
Friend circles and
their friends and things like that.
less suspicious also, or I mean.
Yeah. So, I mean, when this was a big deal when Lad and I were first a couple, again, because I was younger, he was really jealous of me. And he's always convinced I was like fooling around with someone else or something like that. And
He was suspicious of you.
he was suspicious of me.
Yeah.
And it took a while. And this is something that he learned from me, which is that for whatever reason, I'm just not a jealous person. And
What is your age difference? I mean,
12 or 13 years. something
12,
like that.
but so it may also have to do with age, right? Because you were 20s,
Yeah.
early 20s, and he was like
He
early
was
30s, so,
yeah.
or mid 30s. So I mean, I guess that also makes you feel a little more insecure. And
Yeah.
that would also be the same for, say, a very young woman and say a man in his 35 is 35 and a woman who's like 22. So the man would feel insecure, I'm sure. So I mean, I'm just guessing.
Again,
Yeah.
all
No, you're saying
generalization.
something, but you're saying something else. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think he finally realized that I was completely not jealous of him, and he has he's always been far more social than I am, and I think he realized that was a better way to be,
Okay.
and now I think he wishes I had more of my own friends. So because again he's the more social one, so.
Right. So, I mean, most of what you said, I think, applies even to heterosexual relations, probably. Okay, but I feel that it's just another just a conjecture. But I'm saying that would it also be the bonding between in gay couples, whether they're male or whether they're female, be stronger because fewer people understand your relationships. I mean, fewer people out in the outside world because it's already a smaller circle. And a lot of people would also be looking down upon it in a way.
Yeah.
And so would that also be adding to the bonding?
I think that's probably true. Yeah, sure. It's a shared experience. It's a shared sense of other. In the gay community, there's an expression. I mean, you often find that gay people have very close relationships with their friends.
Okay.
And that we refer to as family. Okay, so right now, Lad and I have what we refer to as our pod. Okay, and this is a COVID thing. Okay, so when COVID hit, we all had to pick who are the people who you're going to allow in the circle because it has to be a small number because of COVID. And we have a cabin in the woods, and it's around a lake. And there are two other couples who are good friends of ours, and two lesbian couples, and they are our family.
Okay.
There's an expression in the gay community which is that you have your biological family and you have your logical family.
Logical family.
Yes, and gays create
Nice.
a logical family.
Yeah.
And these are the people who make sense to be my family. And they're not necessarily all gay, but it's people who share a same sense of values and intimacy, which is family-like. And in many ways, it's, I think, stronger because it's constructed.
And who don't judge
Consciously.
you, I guess, also for your choices. I mean, who don't judge you.
Well, judge you for those choices, at any rate.
Yeah, for those
But,
particular choices.
You know, there's a town in Massachusetts at the very tip of Cape Cod called Provincetown, and it is a very gay-dominated town. And you know, people often say, "Oh, well, you go there so that you can be gay," and it's like, actually, it's the opposite. You go there because you don't need to worry about being gay,
gay.
because
That's
everybody is gay.
That's right.
Right. So it changes the norm. So I think it's probably similar to, you know, you often hear African Americans saying, "I want to go to we have what we call HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities in the United States that are black-dominated colleges." And actually, there's just an article in the New York Times about this morning, about how black students, many of them of this generation, they just want to go to a black college, not because they
really?
yeah, and it's not necessarily because they're looking for an
Validation.
African American identity. It's because they don't. It's the background. Like it removes the racism like that. So it's a kind of
Wow.
an interesting twist.
Wow.
And I think it's the same kind of thing, is that you have a gay community because that's where you don't have to be gay. I don't know, it's a weird statement, but
No, but it
hopefully
applies
it makes
even to
sense.
blacks,
Yeah.
or I mean, here it would be
well, any group,
castes and
any group that has been defined by every other group to be a group.
right, absolutely. That's what makes it groups, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Wow. So, Curtis, this was a amazing conversation with you. I mean, I think it was some new things that I have learned. I mean, and that is what I try to do. And I'm sure my audience would. I think that's the world, which is the US and your specific world. I hope it's. I'm sure that a lot of my audience is going to find it pretty interesting and compare it with their own. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting
For
me.
this
It's a real honor.
appreciate it was, and it's this whole new world. I mean, it's amazing to learn from. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I drop a new episode every Friday night at around 10 p.m. I will also end this and every episode by recommending a film or a web series. But before that, here is a small message on how you can help to keep this podcast alive and growing. This episode is free, and we intend to keep it that way. But it does take a lot of time, money, and effort to produce the show. We research, write, record, and edit before we finally present it to you. So if you wish to support our effort, you can help us produce the show by contributing any amount you wish on our website, conversationswithatul.com. Please note that the word conversations is plural with an S. So do visit conversationswithatul.com. And here is my film reco. The film I recommend today is Happy Together. Happy Together is based on the novel The Buenos Aires Affair by Manuel Puig, directed and written for the screen by Hong Kong legend Wong Kar-wai. Happy Together narrates the love story of a gay couple who find themselves lonely and lovelorn in distant Argentina. Happy Together rates a melancholy 7.7 out of 10 on IMDb. Do watch if you haven't already. Follow me on Twitter by following my Twitter handle Atul Taishete, spelled as ATULTAISHETE. Also, do visit my website Conversations, that is Conversations plural with an S. The complete website address is conversationswithatul.com. So see you next Friday at 10 p.m. with a different guest, a new episode, and a fresh conversation right here on Conversations with Atul. Have a rocking fun week and stay safe. Thank you.